So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for a Global Wellness Institute Initiative collaboration call hosted by the Dying Well Initiative in collaboration with the Wellness at Work Initiative. The topic is the importance of grief and end-of-life support in the workplace. And in case you're not aware of our Global Wellness Institute initiatives, I just wanted to quickly show you this slide that showcases all of our 30 initiatives on different industry sectors and topics. And all people involved, the chairs, vice chairs, and members are a global group. They're from around the world, and they work on these on a voluntary basis, and we are very grateful for all their support. And information on all the initiatives, including members, chairs, resources, and what they're working on can be found on the Global Wellness Institute website. And before I turn it over to the initiative co-chairs, I just wanted to give some Zoom logistics and share those with you. So as you know, I muted all of you, so we don't have any background noise, but you can unmute and mute yourself on the bottom left of your Zoom screen. There's a little microphone, and if you click on it, you can mute and unmute yourself. And when you talk for the first time, please share your name, company, country with us so we know who you are. There are also two options to see the screen, either the speaker view, where you can see the person who is speaking, or the gallery view, which shows you the beautiful mosaic of all the participants, and you can switch between those on the top right of your screen. And last but not least, we encourage you to share some questions and comments in the chat. And you can open your chat window by clicking on the chat button on the bottom center of your Zoom screen. And please don't confuse it with the share screen button, because that would be a bit distracting. And now I'm delighted to introduce the co-chairs of the Dying Well Initiative, Amy McDonald and Diane Doster. Amy McDonald is the owner of Under a Tree Health and Wellness Consulting, and was inspired to start this initiative after supporting her parents through their end-of-life journey in their homes. And Diane Doster is the founder and chief relevance officer of Project Relevance, which is a B2B advisory and solution company focusing on innovation and programs for living, aging, and dying better. Thanks so much to both of you and to the initiative for organizing this call today. And now over to you. You need to unmute yourself on the bottom left.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you, Susie. Amy and I are pleased to welcome you here today, wherever you're coming from. It's such an important topic, more relevant today than ever before. Before I introduce our amazing panelists and moderator, I just want to invite us all to recognize that the collective loss and grief that we are all navigating, again, collective and personally, is real, and deserves a silent moment of pause. If we could just take a deep breath in and just be with that, honoring those who are no longer here and the loss of more than just lives. So one of our panelists today, Miriam Senft, comes from the Work initiative of GWI. She's the president and CEO of Motivity Partnerships based in the US. And she has more than 2.5 decades in the corporate world as a project manager, benefits design, and wellness program analysis. She's very much a strategic advisor to many CEOs around wellness and bereavement policy. So welcome, Mim, to our Dying Well initiative and panel. Dr. Candi Cann is the associate professor at Baylor University, is educated at Harvard as a death specialist on grief, dying. She's a certified thanatologist. That's a lot to say this early in the morning. With the Association of Death Education and Counseling in the US. She's a member of the Association of Study of Death and Society of the UK. And she's authored 4 books and many, many, many articles on death and grief wellness. She's a regular speaker in grief workshops within the wellness industry. Originally from Hawaii, she spent much of her childhood overseas and is passionate about fostering conversations about dying well in the global arena. And with population aging comes population dying and loss. So stimulating these conversations has never been more important. And Liz Eddy, also on the Dying Well Initiative, is the CEO of Lantern, co-founder, a single source of guidance for navigating life before and after death. Liz built her first company at 15 and led the communication from inception for the nation's first free 24/7 crisis support line called Crisis Text Line. She's also a board member of Experience Camps, a free summer camp for grieving children. And finally, our newest member to the Dying Well Initiative and moderator today is Dr. Shoshana Ungerleider, founder of the Endwell Project. She is an MD, practicing MD, and also founder of endwellproject.org. She's an internist with Crossover Health in San Francisco, a writer and leading voice in healthcare who regularly appears as a medical contributor on CNN, MSNBC, CBS News, with bylines in Time, Scientific American, the San Francisco Chronicle, Vox, Stat, and many others. She executive produced 2 Netflix Oscar-nominated films, Extremis and Endgame. Her most recent film, Robin's Wish, is a biographical documentary about the final years of actor and comedian Robin Williams. Take it away, Shoshana, and welcome everyone.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you all for joining us. For many of us, it's early in the morning, so I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. And thank you so much to the Global Wellness Institute for hosting this really important conversation. So COVID-19 has changed the conversation in this country and across the world about so many things. Today, we're going to talk about the end of life, grief, and loss. It's really made talking about living and ending well even harder to do, but I would say even more urgent. And COVID has shown us just how fragile life is, that tomorrow is never a given, no matter how old you are. That's, of course, always been the case, but I think COVID has really concentrated that idea for so many people and has shined a light on the hidden world of caregivers, our frontline healthcare workers, our informal family caregivers, as well as grief and loss on a massive scale. Many of us have found ourselves at a place where we're isolated from those that we love. We see and hear stories of loved ones being dropped off at a hospital without knowing what's going to happen next, or even a nursing home. The entire nation's medical fields, as well as untrained and ill-equipped essential workers in the hospitality industry, for example, are really being stretched and pushed to their limits, and where the question of our own mortality is never far away. I think the world is shifting, it's opening its eyes, and what we're seeing right now, really at an unprecedented level, is people taking care of each other. And it may not look like it with everything going on. I think behind the face masks and the protester-filled streets are people standing up and protecting the ones that they love and protecting strangers. It's special and it's unique. And germane to this conversation today, we're all grieving. Even for those of us who haven't lost a family member or a friend, we still experience grief. We've all lost so many elements of the life that we've known for ourselves, for our families, maybe a lost job, missing a child's college graduation. We miss the predictability of daily life, and we grieve the loss of a life that we once knew and one that we hope to live. So we're going to talk a little bit with our panelists here. I would also say, you know, from the medical perspective, we have yet to scratch the surface on the physical, the mental health aspects of just how much grief that we're all facing. And it's incredibly important for people like you all on the call, probably some large employers maybe, to be thinking about how we can best support employees and each other through this continuing challenging time. And so with that, I will just tell you that we'll talk here amongst us for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience. And so, as Beatrice mentioned, please enter your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll get to those after our discussion. So I want to first start with Dr. Candi Cann. And Candi, in what ways has the pandemic highlighted the need for workplaces to have better and more comprehensive bereavement policies and offerings for their employees?
Good morning, everybody. It's so good to be here. And thank you, Shoshana, for starting our discussion off. It's such a great question. So one thing I think that the pandemic has done is it's placed a spotlight on all kinds of systemic issues where institutions are failing. So some countries, such as New Zealand or Germany, are managing quite well in these times. And I would also note that both of those countries have female leaders, while others, like the United States, are revealing cracks through the seams. And so more specifically, I would say that the pandemic has really highlighted class differences. And as a result of those class differences, we're also seeing policy inequities between hourly and salaried employees who may not receive the same comprehensive benefits package, such as sick leave, bereavement leave, which then forces some people to work while sick, spreading the virus. It forces others to feel as though they need to send their kids to school while sick or to work through their grief. And in addition, since the pandemic has hit communities of color the hardest, we're seeing an absolute inequitable distribution on how this affects people of color versus, say, white communities. And I think this is part of the fundamental problem that the pandemic is highlighting these systemic problems and inequities in such a way that now we realize we really have to grapple with these differences.
Yeah, it's been amazing to me, even as somebody who has, studied public health, and I think I understand it, all of these pieces are so interconnected in terms of how this pandemic continues on. And so I really appreciate the point about, better policies around sick leave being that can really help everybody. Mim, do you think more transparent discussion and support around death and dying can impact the corporate bottom line? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah, well, thank you. I just want to thank everyone for including the Wellness at Work initiative. And absolutely. And so I am a very data-driven person. And I think we talk about these things as from an emotional perspective. There was a study that was done back in 2003 in the United States that showed that cost to organizations was about 75 billion. So if you put that 75 billion, let me just repeat that number. So if you put that in 2020 numbers, even before the pandemic, we're talking about $100 billion to the corporate bottom line. And part of the problem is that most organizations still approach death and dying as a point in time, something that happens to someone, and we give them a couple days and they move on. But they're going to be better off if they start to look at this through the lens of like someone who just had major heart surgery. We would never expect an employee that had major heart surgery to come back 2 or 3 days later. And in fact, when we talk about this through the mental health lens in the workplace, someone that has lost a loved one, a spouse, a child, a parent, most of them are going to show up for the first month or two in the same way that somebody that has severe diagnosed depression, not just mild depression. And so there's a real disconnect in the workplace about what it really means to lose someone. There is a study that was done and pretty extensive, asking top managers how they felt and how well they thought they were making decisions. 85% of them said that they thought that they were making poor decisions in the first month or two after the death of a loved one. And if we look at this through a manufacturing perspective or non-white collar jobs, 90% of them show up as having more injuries. So again, when we start talking about expenses, this is workers' comp claims. It also bleeds into costs around self-medication and addiction. And so it's really vital that organizations, and now that we layer the pandemic on top of this, that there are very clear costs that impact your bottom line. And so it's not just a fuzzy, nice thing to talk about. This is something that organizations should be thinking about to protect their bottom line.
Yeah, those real numbers. Wow, that's staggering. And I think it is so important to be as data-driven as possible when we think about these issues, especially for employers. Liz, what Wim just talked about, how big do you think this problem is? We heard 75 or $100 billion. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first and foremost, I imagine there are some people probably listening right now thinking, oh yeah, this is a big problem, but it hasn't happened to us yet. It hasn't happened in my company yet. It hasn't happened with my employees yet. And I just want to take a moment to pause and first acknowledge that statistically speaking, that is highly, highly unlikely. And so I'd encourage everyone who that might have crossed their mind during this conversation after, we hang up, to take some time to really reflect on why it might be that you don't know the employees that are experiencing grief. And if maybe there aren't the right things available to them to feel comfortable to come forward and expressing the experience they're going through. That being said, there are about 16.8 million people grieving the death of someone close to them in the United States annually. So that's about the size of the population of Cambodia or Senegal. And that's also not including people who are grieving someone more distant or experiencing grief of a larger community experience like COVID or a death in the news. It's massive. I also just want to point out quickly, a dear friend of mine and a really brilliant thought leader, Lisa Forneray, really lays out well why this is a growing problem and why this is becoming more and more common as something we should speak more about. And it's 4 different things. One is that there just are more traumatic deaths happening. There's the opioid epidemic. There's a 25% increase in suicide over the last 2 decades. There's gun violence. We're also more connected. So we have a 24-hour news cycle that we're very aware of. We're connected on social media. We feel closer to people that we might not know in person normally. We have an aging population, of course. The largest generation is reaching their life expectancy. There are more people on Earth over the age of 65 than under the age of 5, first time in history that's ever happened. And lastly, there are more caregivers. So today, this is a U.S. statistic, but it's true across the board and particularly impacts women. 1 in 5 Americans are caregivers, and that's according to the AARP 2020 caregiving study.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Candi, you talked a little bit about this in your opening response, but COVID, of course, has highlighted the extreme racial inequities that have always existed, as well as gender inequities in our society. So, of course, communities of color are much more adversely affected by pandemic deaths, serious illness. Women are seeing the inequitable burden of both childcare and emotional labor, which are further amplified in the lack of adequate workplace bereavement policies and practices that we're talking about here. How are you seeing, if at all, your workplace and others providing for diverse populations in this area?
That's a great question. And I will say, so, we're seeing indigenous communities, African Americans and Latinx communities are all experiencing the pandemic at far greater levels than white communities. So we're seeing 4 times the deaths in communities of color. Interestingly enough, it's not impacting Asian Americans in the same way in the United States, but we're seeing this across the globe. And as you mentioned, women do take on the burden of the caregiving, the emotional labor. They, as Liz mentioned, they tend to be the caregivers of the sandwich generation, taking care of both the older generation and the younger generation. And they're often expected culturally and emotionally to not just make the practical arrangements, but to also do the kind of aftercare that follows a death. So workplaces will often say they want diverse environments, but generally they don't provide the time off to deal with the added expectations on them. And when you have communities that are more impacted by the pandemic, then if you really want a diverse workplace, you have to make allowances for the ways in which the pandemic is affecting particular communities more than others. So in other words, the bereavement policies need to be in place that allow for, say, someone who's lost 5 people to COVID. I have a coworker at my university that has lost 5 family members to COVID. So if you have a policy that only allows 3 days off a year for bereavement, and to make disposition accommodations and to handle the estate, and that's it, but you have 5 people that you have lost, then it becomes quite inequitable. So I think workplaces have to put their money where their mouth is. If they really want diverse employee populations, and they actually need to make these kind of accommodations to allow for that to happen. And again, I think the same thing with women in the workplace, which I know that men can talk to more, but I really think that we have to care for women and understand that they are being given a disproportionate amount of not just the actual labor, but the emotional labor as well.
Thank you. Yeah, Mim, you are in fact an expert in workplace policy and design. So following on to Candi's response there, do you think death and dying impact work culture differently for women in the workplace, and or of course employees from a diverse background?
Absolutely. I mean, the data, again, I'm data. And I think again, if we look back at diversity and inclusion and gender issues over the past 40 years, we've done a lot of talk, but the numbers haven't moved very much. And I think this pandemic, as we've said, has highlighted why this is so important. So there was a great report, it's called the Carers Report, that came out in October 2017, came out of Europe. It's a global report, and I would highly recommend, if you're interested, in take a look at the data in there. So just a few of the things that really stuck out for me. 57% of female unpaid caregivers, that means they have a job but they're not getting paid for caring for someone at home, do not feel supported at all by their government. So that should tell you something pretty clearly. 18% of unpaid caregivers in Australia had to give up their job. And we know that the primary caregiver, there are male and female caregivers, I want to be very clear about that, but usually the primary caregiver in every culture is a woman. And so she is the one that is there for the end of life, hospice, starting to deal with everything from gathering family, thinking about the funeral, but then she is usually the one that is also dealing with all the issues after the fact. So not only is this person grieving, but they're dealing with potentially the will, legal issues, cleaning out a house. And so again, it goes back to what I said before, this is not a point in time. And if we look at it through the diversity lens, National Academy of Sciences did a study back in 2017. So to level set this a little bit, if you were Black, you were significantly more likely to have experienced the death of a mother, a father, and a sibling from childhood to midlife. On top of that, if you were Black from young adulthood through later in life, you were much more likely than your white counterpart to have experienced the death of a child and a spouse. So we even start to bleed into some PTSD, and particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement, all of this starts to get layered on. And so I highly recommend organizations that when you're looking at this, this is not a separate silo. It is directly connected to anything you're doing around diversity and inclusion, to gender, to how you're designing your benefits. And unfortunately, if we don't address this, this is where the burnout costs, the turnover costs start to come into play. And so this right now in this moment, we have a huge opportunity as so many organizations are looking at reorganizing. How do we get work done? to more meaningfully address these things and truly build an inclusive culture. And I can't think of a better reason for doing that than addressing grief and mourning so that we can all heal.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, ma'am. Liz, I want to get more into the practical, sort of tactical side of things. What can a manager do to support an employee who is facing grief?
Yeah. So first, as an employer, as a manager, you are not expected to be a bereavement counselor. Don't put that weight on you. Don't try to do it. It's really important. I think sometimes there's this feeling of like, oh, if I'm going to talk to somebody on my team about what they're going through, I have to be able to be a professional counselor. And that's not your role in this position. Your role in this position is to make the person feel supported, like they understand what benefits and services they have access to, and like they're being cared for by the company. I have some just like quick tips for you to use. I'll pop them in the chat too, because I'm just going to kind of run down a little list for you. Kind of going off what Mim said initially, just being aware of how much is on someone's plate, that it is a heavy emotional time, but they're also likely dealing with a lot of logistics and family dynamics and things you might not understand. So knowing there's just a lot going on in the background. Making sure you're checking in regularly on their self-care, putting a reminder even in your phone or your calendar of important dates. Remembering a death date a year later or 2 years later or 3 years later is one of the most kind and thoughtful things you can do. It doesn't have to be a big proclamation. It could be a text with a heart on the day, whatever it might be, just acknowledging that they're going through something that day and every day. And if you're going to offer to help, being really specific about what you're offering. So just saying like, hey, let me know if you need anything, puts the onus on the person to tell you what to do versus saying, hey, I noticed, that, there's a bunch of stuff left on your desk. I organized your papers to make sure, everything is good when you came back. Like you can just keep it really simple and straightforward. Don't assume timelines of when the person's going to be quote unquote better. There is no timeline for being better. So just don't have that expectation. And then, if you have experienced a loss, recognizing every loss is different. So don't assume that the person is feeling or going through what you're going through or what you've been through, but also check in with yourself because it does bring up a lot of, emotional response when you're supporting someone else who's grieving. These are just a few high-level things. There's a lot of stuff I'm happy to share with anyone. If you want to reach out to me, I'll pop some things in the chat too that you can just quickly look at.
Thank you, Liz. I think it's helpful to think about the fact that there are major, company-wide things that can be done around policy, but then there's also the smaller things and the things that we would normally do with a friend or someone that we love, and that can be, day to day really impactful for people. And I want to just remind folks, if you have questions or comments, please type them in the chat. We'll be getting to your questions very soon here. Mim, mental health is a growing concern for many leaders and organizations, and of course the world. The CDC data that's come out over the last few months around the mental health impacts of COVID, especially in America, are staggering. How does educating leaders and managers on this topic impact the workforce, particularly now during the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, as you pointed out, the numbers are astronomical, and the Kaiser Foundation has also put out some great data around this. And so to level set a little bit, the NIH puts out a report around mental health in the workplace like every year. So prior to COVID, approximately 30% of your population, your work population at any given time has a mental health issue. And again, we know that people don't connect to their EAPs, employee assistance programs, in the ways that we need them to. I would also caution leaders to understand that EAPs are supposed to be there to support the mental health and well-being issues. It's not one size fits all. They are not all equal. So I highly recommend you taking a deep dive into what they are, who they provide, and I think the other thing this also bleeds into D&I. So it's not one size fits all. Do the mental health support system also support people from diversity backgrounds? And it's a huge issue. To be blunt, if all my mental health support system is white and I'm Black, or I'm Latinx, or I'm whatever, there are cultural differences in things that do not get addressed. And oftentimes people will not call back, will not even reach out. So I'm very big on getting leaders to push the providers that they're paying for to make these differences happen. And again, we need to understand too that when people have lost more than 2, 3, 4, and I will tell you personally, there is not a week in the past 6 months that has gone by that I haven't talked to somebody in my network that either had COVID, was taking care of somebody who had COVID, had dealt with somebody who had died of COVID, or had lost a family member and couldn't go to the funeral or grieve because of COVID. And so this is just exacerbating the problem. And it's important to deal with the bias around mental health and well-being. So you may have a great EAP, you may have a great conversation with your employees, but if you don't truly address some of those cultural norms about we are just going to push through this, or in America, like the John Wayne approach, that we're just going to power through this, the cost to organizations right now is going to be astronomical. And it does cause things like PTSD. We usually think about that through a veteran's lens, but the truth is seeing multiple deaths. And as you touched on, Shoshana, at the beginning, it's everything we're losing in our communities. It's coming back into the workforce and realizing that half of the people that you used to work with had to be let go. And there is grieving around that. I know that I've talked to leaders, and I think maybe the most important thing is your key leaders really need to have a strong support system behind them. They're the ones out there talking about this. They're the ones that need to lead by example. And if they have their own bias or their own fears or their own unaddressed issues, death is a difficult topic. And, I agree 100%. You are not there to be the counselor, but you do need to know kind of where you are so that you can lead your organization forward. And investing in this right now and really understanding and doing this strategically is going to get us through a lot of next normals, because we don't know where we're going to be over the next 12 months. So showing that level of care and understanding. And frankly, if you're a leader that really feels uncomfortable with this, that's okay. Go find somebody else in your organization that can be the spokesperson. There is nothing wrong with doing that. Again, it is tough, but at the same time, I just so believe this is an opportunity to make things better and make your workforce more resilient.
Absolutely. Mim, thank you for pointing that out. I mean, I think that for those of us that work in this space and think about it day in and day out, we often forget that these conversations are so hard, no matter how expert we are in having them. And so pointing that out, that this is a very challenging, very emotional, personal subject to delve into is, I think, helpful to kind of normalize that as well. Liz, for those tuning in, again, back to more of the practical, what can a company do right now to improve their bereavement support and offerings? It's probably a lot of things, but just the high level.
Yeah, this is a long conversation, but there are a couple of sort of key things to think about right now. First, having resources and benefits secured before you're in a state of panic where you need them. I can't tell you how often people reach out to us that have had either lost an employee or had an employee lose someone close to them. And they're like, quick, can you send me, all the resources and services I can make available to them? And of course we can, but it's really important to have this information be available and accessible before you're in sort of this crisis state. So that includes things like knowing what your local crisis lines are, available local support groups. Right now, understanding sort of the environment of virtual capabilities. So that's virtual grief support, that's virtual funeral and memorial planning, and offering those services as a resource. And then there's also, actual benefits that you can offer as a company, things that range from therapy with a grief focus. And I put that in bold. Therapy with a grief focus is really important. Not every therapist can help someone who is grieving. It is a specific skill set. And so making sure that is available. Also things like end of life planning and funeral planning are all benefits that can be offered to your employees. Making sure you're educating employees, A, on how to speak to and support an employee who is grieving, and B, making sure they know what your policies are, what resources are available before you're in that state of crisis. People should be able to feel empowered in knowing what is available to them. And lastly, and not least importantly, making sure that you are really clearly stating your bereavement policy and really thinking about what it means to your employees. I often help people create their bereavement policies, and we have a very sort of forward-thinking way of how we present our bereavement policies. It is not the 3-day, standard policy theory that it currently exists in a lot of employers. But I'm saying clearly state your bereavement policy, meaning make sure people know what it is and make sure it is written down and available and accessible in a handbook. If you do not clearly state your bereavement policy, what ends up happening is people try to guess what it is. So they assume it's a 3-day policy typically. And also it allows for unfair treatment of different employees, because what ends up happening is employees ask their manager how much time they can get. They try to guess how much time that they're offered. And some managers will say, yeah, 3 days. And some will say, oh, I really love this employee. Take as much time as you need, which means that some people get more space for their, bereavement care and emotional care, and others don't. I also would just please encourage everyone to make sure that you are not saying for immediate family members. That means you're discounting, unmarried couples, you're discounting best friends, you're discounting an aunt that took care of you, a child who is your neighbor that you took care of into your home. There are a lot of different definitions of what immediate family is, and so do not specify what that means.
Yeah, so much there. We're about to get to audience questions. So if those burning questions or comments, please type them in the chat now. Candi, so given that this is your area of academic study, can you talk about the impact that offering support surrounding death and grief in the workplace can make for employees, but then also for society at large?
Yeah, so both Mim and Liz have touched on this, but one of the things that having better bereavement policies and clearly stated policies can do is help with employee presenteeism. And if you have a workplace culture in which you can actually talk about death and talk about grief and be open about it, rather than kind of implying that grief should be saved for the home, then it's a better environment for the employee, and the workplace will be able to kind of keep in touch with how the employee is doing at the time. On a larger scale, I think one of the things we need to do is move away from stage-based grief models. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross still continues to be the dominant model of grieving. She came up with the 5 stages of grieving for dying, not for actual grief after death. And so her model still continues to be misapplied to grief. Also, people who utilize stage-based grief models tend to kind of feel disappointed in themselves that they haven't actually worked through the stages, or they think they're not grieving appropriately or well because they're not moving through the stages. And the recent grief theory in the last 25 years or so has really revolutionize a way we think about grief. It's messy. We oscillate between different polarities of feeling well and feeling poorly. I prefer either Strobe and Schutz's dual process model, which basically says one day you're going to feel great, another day you're not, or the continuing bonds model from Dennis Class, in which we reintegrate the deceased into our lives by continuing to have some form of a relationship with them, either through setting up a space for them at the dinner table and letting them share in our meal, or setting up a small altar in a corner of the house. These are really healthy ways in which we can kind of walk through life with the dead and not feel like we have to get over them. So I think language becomes really important, not just in the workplace, but also culturally, how we grieve and how we accept people who are grieving. As a thanatologist, I'm really excited that we're actually talking about death, although it's very difficult for me to see the reasons why. And I think this is a really difficult time. I do have a resource here that I'll pop in the chat, which deals specifically with how to grieve and how to hold funerals during the time of COVID. Shoshana, I think you were a part of this too, and Liz was part of this. but this was a paper put together by over 80 different scholars who specialize in this area. And it's a wonderful, it's a website now, but it's a wonderful list of tools and resources that people can draw on to help them through this process.
Yeah, it is a fantastic resource, Candi. Thank you so much for spearheading that effort and sharing that in the chat. We're going to get to your questions and comments now. And I just want to say, you know, I think that we're just scratching the surface in terms of, as a country and as a, you know, our world at large, coming up with a new vocabulary around what this pandemic, you know, really has done in terms of the death, the grief, and the bereavement of so many people. And without our sort of federal leaders taking a pause and even recognizing it in this moment, I think it's incredibly important that we ourselves normalize these conversations, talk openly about them, both in our homes and in the workplace. And I do think that we will find you know, healing in one another and come up with a new way to sort of talk about this shared human experience. So with that, I'm gonna hop over to the chat here. Many people commented that they do want that reference for the 2017 data that Mim talked about caregiving. So we'll make sure to share that out. And Regina asked, an employee lost her 5-year-old grandchild due to a stroke very suddenly within hours. My policy was to give her the time that she needed. Her colleague stepped in. When you know firsthand, you need to have policies in place. If you don't grieve, it'll come back years later with health and mental health issues. There must be data out there for that. Because I am not aware specifically of any data. Is anybody sort of familiar with that around when grief goes unrecognized? What are the mental health, the overall health and well-being impacts?
I'm happy to share what I learned from Dr. Dale Atkins, and some of you may know her. She's done a lot of work around PTSD and grief, and actually I've talked to her pretty extensively about this. And so she said a lot of the research shows, and I'll try and get back to her and dig it out for anybody who wants this, because, you know, I think it's always important to have the data to back it up. But again, we're in a society, not every society, but certainly in the US, where too often, again, and I've said it before, we push through, we don't go through the grieving process, and it ends up then somebody else dies, and this triggers people. It is actually works in the same way that PTSD does, that suddenly all those things that you never dealt with initially, and I'm gonna make this a little bit personal. So first, I just wanna do a public shout out to Nancy Davis, because 3 years ago, my father passed away on the 18th of September, and she was one of the people that reached out to me. And this is the personal side of this. Who in your network, who of your colleagues are the people that are going to be there for you and get you through this? I pushed through. My father passed away. I had 2 events. One of them was the Global Wellness Summit, which I so wanted to be there for. But I can tell you, personally, knowing everything I know about workplace wellness and everything else, that I just pushed and pushed and pushed. I walked out of the gala event because I just was not in an emotional place for this. And I ended up pushing and pushing, and I got sick. And it took me a full year of working through this. I actually did write a personal article about this because I felt it was so important to talk about. And it doesn't mean that I didn't work or I didn't do these other things, but the impact to your employees, the impact to your team, if you don't recognize their need to mourn. And I love, Candi, that you talked about this is different for different people. So some people really do need to get back to normalcy and work. You know, others need time off. I mean, there is no one size fits all here. And so I would encourage you, as you're looking at your policies, to think about that. And again, was this the primary caregiver? Do they actually need more time or more support in other key areas? Is it somebody from a diversity background? And maybe there's education that has to happen with the team around them in a more specific way. And not everybody coming back to work wants to hear, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. That can be overwhelming. And so having the opportunity, this is where HR comes into play. if they reach out and say, what do you need? How do you want to come back into the workplace? That can alleviate a lot of stress. And so it really is about how that person needs to grieve, and knowing that it may come back 2 or 3 or 4 months down the road, particularly if you were the primary caregiver over months. And I'm also going to say this: policies are great, but as the very famous business quote goes, culture eats policy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So yes, we must put in policies, but we also have to do the deeper work in the cultures to uproot some of the biases that we have around this and some of our fears, so that we can truly be purpose-driven in our organizations and solve for this.
So I'd like to follow up on what Mim said. So there's a lot of work that's been done on what's called complicated grief, in which grief gets quite, and as Mim said, grief compounds grief. So if you haven't worked through, even if you have worked through one death, another death will reinforce the initial loss that you experienced, mainly because you have these holes in your social structure and in your life now, and it just makes you, it reminds you of the other holes that are there. That being said, it's very interesting because in Chinese religion, once upon a time, I lived in China for 6 years and studied Chinese religion. In Chinese religion, in Chinese medicine, it says that grief is manifested through the lungs and asthma. And so they believe that if you have asthma, then you have some unresolved grief issues, which is very interesting on a personal level for me. When my mom died, I actually developed asthma, very severe asthma. And when I read this, I was very defensive. I was like, that's not, I just happened to develop asthma at the same time. But it definitely made me think about this mind-body connection. I think that we don't examine enough here in the West. And I do think that grief will manifest itself in many other ways. Also, Mim talked about how some people grieve in different ways. They just want to get back to work. And Ken Doka, who's done a lot of really valuable work on grief and gender, he talks about how a lot of people grieve through being busy, that they're what's called instrumental grievers as opposed to intuitive grievers. An intuitive griever gives themselves the space to fall apart, to sit at home, to cry, and then they kind of gradually put themselves together. An instrumental griever grieves by getting busy, by doing, by action. All of these different grieving patterns are okay. It just kind of depends on the person you are and how you work through your grief. So grief looks very different from person to person. And then my last comment will be on the policy. While we encourage workplaces to have policies, part of the problem is that people then use those policies to inform their own evaluation of themselves and their grief process. For example, the DSM says that if you're grieving more than 2 weeks, then maybe you are showing signs of depression. So then people say, oh, I'm still grieving and it's been 3 weeks. There's something wrong with me. Same thing with these workplace policies, right? Oh, I've had 3 days off and I'm not ready to go back. There must be something wrong with me. Absolutely not. So we need to really be careful about not letting these policies inform our grief process and the time it takes to learn to live with the grief.
Yeah, I also would just like one more thing, that not handling these situations well causes a huge loss of loyalty for employees. And that's not just loyalty of the individual who is directly being impacted by the policy or experience, but it's also how poorly the situation is being handled. And I've witnessed this many times in different workplaces and with people that I've worked with, where they've lost somebody and they don't get the proper support that they need. And that becomes a very common conversation that spreads through their teams and through other teams and becomes a larger sort of collective experience. It also expands to larger sort of national and global events. I know a lot of companies and a lot of management are very cautious about openly discussing world events. I experienced in my last company a huge sort of obvious lack of discussion around the Black Lives Matter movement here in the US. And it caused a lot of pain, particularly for the Black and brown employees within the company, because they felt like their grief was not being acknowledged. And so I think it's really important. It can be as simple as saying, the news today was really heavy. If anyone needs to take the rest of the day, you're welcome to do so. Just making that simple acknowledgement and allowing people to see that, okay, my company supports me. They see that I'm going through something, can be really powerful.
Thank you. We have a question from Diane. How can corporate wellness initiatives incorporate healing into their strategy and programming?
There you go. Great question, and one I'm very passionate about. Most corporate health and well-being, when we talk about wellness, it's still seen through this lens of physical health, get to the gym, eat healthy, do these things. And all of that's great with this idea, we're going to thrive, we're great. We don't think of health and well-being through the lens of somebody that is working through the loss of someone, is maybe fighting cancer on their own, like going through chemotherapy. There are different ways of looking at health and well-being in the workplace. And I am a huge proponent of integration. Don't leave wellness and your health, over in this nice little bucket, and not have a clear connection to how are your benefits actually designed? What kind of numbers are you seeing? This is real data, right? So you can look at your benefit spend over the past 3 to 5 years, and there's all kinds of interesting pieces of information you can get out of that. Bring in your HR people. And I'm going to say one other thing that's a little bit out there probably for some, is that in the world we're in right now, people are afraid to come back into the office or into a working environment, right? We are afraid of we're going to catch COVID. Let's just be upfront about this. So how is your property management teams, right, working with everyone? And then it goes back to the third piece, is it integrated? And how are you communicating it? Because I guarantee you that if you put one policy out and you do one initiative around this, no one will remember what it is. Marketing 101 tells us you have to touch people 5 to 7 times before they ever really understand what it is. And in white collar, just again, level setting, white collar workers in general get 150 emails a day, every day. And so your one little announcement about this new policy or this new thing over there, too often gets lost in the mix. And so that's where the strategy comes in. What does your workforce need? What are the biggest pain points around these things? What do you already have that you're paying for that can be integrated and used in these? And how are you going to measure whether this is successful or not? Because to me, that's where the rubber hits the road. I've watched wellness. I do go on my high horse about this, but wellness has been around, worksite wellness, literally for more than 40 years. Early in my career, I went to stress management classes. I don't think we're any less stressed. And so ask yourself, if you are a leader paying for this, is what I'm paying for actually delivering on what I need it to deliver? Who are the partners, and are they willing to work collaboratively? So everything from your ergonomics, and I know it sounds, to your registered dietitian, to your mental health professionals, how do you make this the arms around your employees versus these one-off programs? And it can be done. There are organizations that have done this successfully. And I would ask you to please consider geography, ageism, all these other pieces of the puzzle as you're building your strategy. Because if you put the work in early on, you're going to be more successful.
Well, wow. Thank you, Mim. This was an incredible conversation. Thank you to our panelists. There's been so many incredible comments, as I'm sure everyone's following along in the chat, people sharing personal experiences, thoughts. I wish I could just sit and read the chat for a while. But I want to hand it back to GWI to close us out, and just thank everyone for their participation. And it's such an honor to be with you. I know I learned a lot from all of you. So thank you.
Well,
Thank
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mim, Candi, Shoshana, and Liz. It was very insightful. It's an important topic to address. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As mentioned in the chat, we will send out a follow-up email, including all the information, all the links, all the contact details, so you can reach out to the experts and ask questions. And we are recording this call, and this will also be posted on the website of the Global Wellness Institute and also sent out with the follow-up email. Susie, Nancy, the last words are for you. Thank you, everybody.
I'm sorry that I missed the first few minutes. I hope that everybody learned about Shoshana and her event that she does, her Endwell event and her project, because it's so incredibly aligned with everything we're doing. So I think in the follow-up, we should definitely link to that and talk about that. I would like to just say thank you. This is an initiative that everybody knows is very near and dear to my heart. I have a challenge for this group. I have long thought that there should be an app that people could have that would contain all of the information as a, let's say, as a child with an elderly parent, that you would need to manage the end of life very well for your family member, partner, spouse, whatever. And it would have all the resources, all the medical records, all the information about estate planning, all of these situations, resources, your network, calendars, all of this. I actually tried, was part of a project that was thinking about developing this, but I think somebody needs to take this and make it something really accessible that everybody could have with them. It's like everyone has a personal experience. My mother was incredibly organized, so she had all of this. And when I told people were like, oh my God, I've got to get organized. I've got to sit with my family while they're alive and healthy and can tell me things and get all of the records and the names of their doctors and the people that should be contacted and the funeral homes and the grief resources and the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Put it in one place. I challenge this group to make that app.
Nancy, I can proudly tell you that's exactly what I do.
Perfect.
Yeah, Lantern is a single point solution for all things end of life and death planning. So that includes everything before and after someone passes away. But you make a really good point, and exactly what we're doing is building out further into the sort of like hospice care, choosing like senior living facilities. We're trying to move a little bit more in that direction. It's definitely a massive, massive multi-tiered sort of, you go into a lot of industries as you develop the product, but but we're tackling it stage by stage.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And Nancy for challenging the group. I think what we can do and would like to do is to help give more voice, more visibility to all of the things that you're doing. I wanted to just let Shoshana end it by telling us a little bit about her event, date, and so on, because it's something I think we should all know about. Shoshana?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So Endwell is a nonprofit organization that I started 3 years ago. This year, our event, of course, is virtual on December 10th. It's called Take 10, with the idea that you can first take 10 minutes to reflect personally on your life, to then talk about the end of it. And it is a virtual experience that features A-list celebrities, unsung heroes, less well-known people, but doing incredible work in their fields, talking about what living well until the very end means in the context of COVID, which is inclusive of the caregiving experience, the mental health experience, the inequities around healthcare access, grief and loss, as well as the death and dying experience. And so it's free, it's open to everybody. This year, the goal is really to reach as many people as possible to start normalizing these hard but incredibly important conversations. You can find out more at endwellproject.org. And I also typed the link to register in the chat.
And all of that we'll get in the follow-up too. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Shoshana. And Amy, let's trumpet that in December so that we can get more and more of this conversation out. Beatrice, last word for you.
Thank you. So since Zoom changed the settings and I cannot unmute all of you anymore, please feel free to unmute yourself on the bottom left and just say goodbye to everyone. And thanks so much again for joining us today.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks for the shout out,
Thank you, everyone.